The air in the deep woods of Clackamas County, Oregon carries a weight you can feel. It's heavy with the primordial scent of pine and damp, decaying earth, a perfume that clings to your clothes and settles deep in your lungs. This is a place that feels ancient, a place where the towering Douglas firs stand like silent, green-robed sentinels, whispering secrets just beyond the range of human hearing. For the people in the small, forgotten logging town of Shadow Creek, the sanctuary of the White Cloud was a beacon on the hill, a place of peace, a place of charity, a place run by a benevolent abbot who seemed to embody the very serenity the landscape itself promised. But on the 10th of July, 2008, the fragile, carefully constructed illusion of peace was about to be violently, irrevocably shattered. It began with the smell. 4 local teenagers, steeped in the invincible boredom of summer, had decided to cut through the dense woods behind the sanctuary. They were looking for a secluded spot by the creek to drink the 6-pack of cheap beer they'd managed to buy with a blurry borrowed ID. The path was overgrown, a barely there trail of trampled ferns and broken twigs, but they knew the way. That morning, however, something was wrong. The usual clean, sharp scent of pine was being choked out by something else, a sweet, cloying stench of rot. The kind of foul smell that coats the back of your throat and makes your stomach heave. It was the unmistakable smell of death, concentrated and corrupting. They followed it, their morbid curiosity wrestling with and overpowering their disgust. The smell led them to a patch of earth that was simply wrong. It was lumpy, disturbed, uneven, as if the ground itself was suffering from some terrible swollen disease. A thick, lazy cloud of flies, their bodies an iridescent metallic green, buzzed in a low, hungry hum over the spot. One of the boys, braver or perhaps just stupider than the rest, nudged the loose, dark soil with the toe of his worn-out skate shoe. He figured it was a dead deer, maybe a black bear that had crawled off to die. He dug a little deeper with a fallen branch, his friends groaning in a chorus of disgust behind him, and then he saw it, clawing its way out of the shallow, blasphemed earth, a human arm. The flesh was charred, blackened, and grotesquely decomposed, but the shape was unmistakable. A hand, its fingers curled into a silent, desperate, final claw. The scream that tore from the boy's throat was shrill and animalistic, a sound of pure terror that sent the birds scattering from the high branches of the ancient trees. They ran without looking back, tumbling over each other in a blind, gasping panic, leaving the suffocating smell and the unspeakable horror behind them. Within the hour, the deep woods were no longer silent. They were filled with the sharp crackle of police radios and the grim, determined footsteps of men who were paid to look directly into the abyss. The area was cordoned off with bright yellow tape, a stark, artificial violation of the natural palette of green and brown. Detective Miles Corrigan of the county sheriff's office stood at the edge of the scene, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn brown leather jacket. He was a man built of sharp angles and quiet, relentless observation, his face a weathered roadmap of too many long nights and too many grim discoveries. He looked at the large, disturbed area of earth, much larger than would be needed for a single body. A cold, heavy certainty settled in his gut. This wasn't one grave. This was a dumping ground. He gave a curt nod to the forensic team. They began to excavate, their movements precise, careful, and practiced. As they scraped away the first layers of soil and dead, damp leaves, the putrid smell intensified, becoming a physical presence, a suffocating, gagging wave of decay. They found fragments of cloth first, a rough brown fabric, coarse to the touch. Miles knelt, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. He picked up a piece, holding it up to the dappled light filtering through the canopy. One of the younger deputies, his face pale and beaded with sweat, recognized it with a dawning horror. It looked like a monk's robe or a nun's. Then the bodies began to emerge from the soil, not whole but in pieces, a macabre puzzle of human remains. A leg here, a torso there, a tangled, soil-caked mat of dark hair fused to a decomposing skull. The varying states of decay were immediately horrifyingly apparent. Some were skeletal, the bones picked clean by the patient work of the earth and its countless tiny creatures. Others were more recent, their flesh a grotesque, nightmarish landscape of liquefaction and putrefaction. It was a layered cake of death. By noon, they had unearthed the partial remains of at least 6 females. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, as the dig continued, more bodies were found, stacked crudely on top of each other, wrapped in rotting sheets of that same old brown fabric. It confirmed Detective Corrigan's initial, sickening fear. This was a mass grave. By the end of the next day, the final horrific tally was confirmed. 13 bodies, all female, all estimated to be between 20 and 30 years old, and all of them, in one way or another, were wrapped or dressed in the brown fabric of a monastic robe. The evidence was irrefutable. A mass grave of nuns lay rotting just a stone's throw from the tranquil, pristine walls of the sanctuary of the White Cloud. The sanctuary was a glaring, obscene paradox. To the good, simple people of Shadow Creek, it was a source of pride, a touch of worldly spirituality in their rugged, isolated corner of the world. The abbot, a man they knew as Abbot Thomas, was revered. He was a thin, ascetic man in his late 50s with a soft, gentle voice and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, compassionate, ancient wisdom. He organized food drives for the town's poor. He offered shelter and counseling to troubled youth. He had built this place from nothing, a refuge of Eastern philosophy blended with Western self-help, a perfect spiritual cocktail for the lost and searching souls of modern America. The image of this peaceful, charitable sanctuary now clashed violently with the macabre reality of the charnel pit that lay just beyond its back gate. Miles Corrigan's investigation naturally, immediately, focused on the temple. On the morning of the 11th of July, he and his partner, Detective Alvarez, walked up the hand-laid stone steps, past the gently tinkling wind chimes that now sounded a hollow, mocking melody in the breeze. Abbot Thomas met them at the heavy oak door. He was the very picture of calm, sorrowful cooperation. His thin frame was draped in a clean, perfectly pressed brown robe. He expressed profound shock and horror at the news of the discovery, his face a well-rehearsed mask of solemn disbelief. He offered them tea. "This is a terrible, terrible tragedy, Detective," he said, his voice as smooth and measured as a riverstone. "Those poor, lost souls." Miles sat across from him in a simple Spartan room that smelled of sandalwood incense. The cloying sweet scent fought a losing battle with the faint lingering odor of decay that seemed to have permanently embedded itself in Miles's own clothes. "Abbot," Miles began, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "we have reason to believe the victims were nuns, perhaps women from this sanctuary." The abbot shook his head slowly, a gesture of deep, practiced sadness. "That is almost impossible to comprehend. We have only 7 permanent residents here, Detective. Many young women come to us for short-term practice. They seek solace, guidance, a respite from the world. They stay for a few weeks, a few months, and then they move on. The path of enlightenment is a personal journey, and it is different for everyone. It is difficult, you understand, to keep track of their precise movements once they decide to leave our care." "You keep a register? A logbook of who comes and goes?" Alvarez asked, his pen poised over his notepad. "Of course," the abbot said, and he rose gracefully, retrieving a simple leather-bound ledger from a nearby shelf. He slid it across the polished wooden table. Miles opened it. It was incomplete, almost purposefully vague. Names were jotted down, but there were no photographs, no next of kin listed, no forwarding addresses for those who had supposedly left. It was a record designed to forget, not to remember. "I don't recognize these names," Miles said, though it was a lie. His finger traced a list of 13 women who had registered for short stays between March and October of the previous year, 2007, the exact time frame the forensic team had suggested for the murders. The abbot leaned forward, squinting at the list, his brow furrowed in a performance of deep concentration. "Some of the names are familiar, yes, vaguely, but as I said, they left. I believe this one," he pointed, "went back to her family in Ohio. Another decided to travel to India to study with a master there. They found their peace and moved on. None of them, to my knowledge, disappeared suddenly or under any unusual circumstances." His answers were too smooth, too practiced. There was no flicker of panic in his calm eyes, no genuine confusion, just a placid, deeply unnerving calm. Miles and his team spent the rest of the day interviewing the other residents, a quiet, stooped monk named Brother Michael, whose eyes were constantly downcast, fixed on the floorboards. Two young nuns named Sister Claire and Sister Annabelle. They were all evasive, their faces blank, frightened masks of denial. They claimed to know nothing of any strange events, nothing of any missing women, but Miles saw the flicker of raw fear in Sister Claire's eyes when he asked her about a specific nun she had been seen with on numerous occasions at the town market. I don't remember her," she stammered, her gaze darting involuntarily towards the abbot, who stood silently observing from the doorway. "She said she was going home." Her hesitation was a tiny crack in the solid wall of silence, a fissure that Miles knew he would have to hammer at until it broke wide open. The police began to dig, not just into the damp, blood-soaked earth, but into the history of the sanctuary and the fleeting, ghost-like lives of the women who had passed through its gates. They cross-referenced the names from the abbot's useless ledger with missing persons reports from across the country. There were no official reports. These women were the type to fall through the cracks. They were transient, often disconnected from their families, the kind of lonely searching people who could vanish from the face of the earth without raising a single alarm. They were vulnerable. They were perfect victims. But the villagers of Shadow Creek had longer memories than any official database. An old woman who ran a small diner near the temple, a place the nuns sometimes visited, recalled several of the young women. "Nice girls," she said. "Quiet, polite, but she hadn't seen any of them since late last year. They had just stopped coming." A man who owned the town's only electronics store recalled a young nun with a Chinese accent trying to buy a simple prepaid mobile phone in the summer of 2007. She seemed nervous, he said. A week later, he never saw her again. These disparate accounts began to form a pattern of unexplained disappearances, a pattern that coincided chillingly with the period of the body's decomposition. The forensic reports from the lab began to paint a clearer, more horrifying picture. Some of the bodies had been in the ground for well over 6 months, reduced to little more than skeletons. Others were far more recent, perhaps only 3 or 4 months old. This wasn't a single, explosive act of violence. This was a continuous, systematic process of murder, a slaughterhouse operating in slow, methodical motion. The formal top-to-bottom search of the sanctuary itself began on the 14th of July. It was methodical, painstaking work. Miles felt like an archaeologist of modern evil, sifting through the carefully curated layers of a toxic, hidden civilization. In the temple's large, cool, and otherwise immaculate storeroom, a small, dark stain on a single gray slate tile caught his eye. It was almost invisible, as if it had been scrubbed repeatedly, but not quite erased. He pointed, "Bag it, test it." 3 days later, on the 17th of July, in a cluttered utility room near the back of the temple, a detective found a small scrap of torn brown fabric. It was snagged on a rusty nail near an old, disused door. It had a few faded Chinese characters finely embroidered on it, a detail that seemed oddly specific and out of place in this westernized spiritual center. Near a dusty wall in the same storeroom, another officer found a string of wooden prayer beads, the kind known as mala beads. They were dark with age or use, with a single, distinctive Sanskrit character intricately carved into the main guru bead. Small things, seemingly insignificant. But Miles knew that murder cases were often solved by the accumulation of small, damning things. On the 19th, the first lab report came back. The stain on the fabric scrap was blood, and it matched the blood type of one of the skeletons recovered from the grave. On the 25th, another report. The prayer beads had trace amounts of dead skin cells trapped in the carvings, and the DNA was a likely match for another one of the victims. The noose was slowly, imperceptibly tightening. The real, undeniable breakthrough came on the 26th of July. Miles, acting on a gnawing hunch, directed a search of the attic rooms, spaces the abbot had breezily claimed were used only for the storage of old furniture and seasonal decorations. In a small, forgotten room at the end of a dark, narrow corridor tucked away under the sloping eaves, they found it. A heavy, antique, locked wooden chest covered in a thick, undisturbed shroud of dust and cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been touched in a generation. The officers pried it open with a crowbar. The old iron hinges shrieked in protest, the sound echoing in the silent, stuffy air. Inside, nestled among a jumble of old, brittle scriptures and tarnished ceremonial objects, was a brown robe. It had been shortened, crudely hemmed with clumsy stitches, and it was stained. There were dark, ugly, rust-colored patches spattered across the front, stains that had soaked deep into the coarse fabric. The abbot, when confronted with the chest and its gruesome contents, maintained his serene composure. He denied any knowledge of it. "It must have been here for years," he said, his voice still unnervously calm. "From the people who owned the property before us, perhaps. Many people have come and gone." But forensics do not lie. The lab report came back on the 27th. It was a bombshell. The stains on the tile in the storeroom were confirmed as human blood. The stains on the robe from the attic chest were also human blood. And from these, they got a clean, perfect DNA match. The DNA belonged to one of the skeletons unearthed from the mass grave, a young woman from China's Zhuan province, a detail confirmed by the specific characters embroidered on the other scrap of fabric. A nun who had, according to the abbot's own ledger, registered for a short stay in mid-2007 and then supposedly gone home. The murder weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. The murder weapon was the sanctuary itself. The attic room was now a confirmed crime scene. Underneath a set of loose floorboards in an adjacent, equally dusty attic room, they found something else. A small cloth bundle, hidden away like a desperate final secret. Inside was a cheap plastic comb, a small, intricately carved pouch of beads, and a folded, crumpled note. The handwriting was frantic, almost illegible, the ink blurred by what could have been water or tears, but two words written in English were painfully, heartbreakingly clear: home and escape. It was the last will and testament of someone who knew they were trapped, someone who had planned to flee and had failed. The wall of silence at the sanctuary, already cracked, was beginning to crumble. The fear of the police was slowly starting to outweigh the institutionalized fear of the abbot. On the 15th of July, even before the discovery of the damning chest, a young nun named Sister Annabelle had secretly contacted Detective Alvarez, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold her phone. She spoke in a frantic whisper, her eyes wide with a terror that was clearly not just for the police. She told him that 2 months ago she had heard crying from one of the old locked storerooms at night, a woman's weeping, muffled and desperate. The next day, one of the other nuns, a quiet girl from out of state, was gone. Her clothes, her meager possessions, everything had simply vanished. When Annabelle had dared to ask about it, the abbot had told her sternly, his voice cold, that she was not to speak of it again. The girl had been homesick. The girl had simply gone home. Now, on the 28th of July, they brought Sister Annabelle to the station and showed her a photograph of the torn robe found in the attic. She confirmed seeing it there. She said the abbot had found her lingering near the room once and had told her never to touch the chest, that it contained sacred, ancient objects that were not her concern. A direct, provable contradiction of his earlier denial to Miles. That same day, they brought in Sister Claire again. Faced with Annabelle's testimony and the irrefutable forensic evidence of the blood-stained robe, she finally broke down. Sobbing uncontrollably, she confessed that she had suspected for months that people were being held captive in the old rooms. She had heard pleading cries at night. She had seen the abbot locking the heavy doors to that entire section of the sanctuary, something he had never done before. When she had voiced her concerns to him, the abbot had dismissed them with his infuriating, placid calm. It was the wind whistling through the eaves, he had said, or perhaps troubled outsiders, drug addicts or homeless people who sometimes wandered onto the ground seeking shelter. She had been too scared to question him further. She had chosen to believe the lie because the truth was simply too monstrous to contemplate. The trickle of information became a flood. A local man named Jedediah Stone, a grizzled, solitary hunter who lived on the edge of the forest, came forward on the 21st. He said that back in May of the previous year, he'd been tracking a deer near the temple grounds late one evening. Through his binoculars, he saw a figure in a brown robe dragging a woman into a back room of the sanctuary. The woman was struggling, her feet kicking feebly against the ground. He hadn't reported it. "You don't mess with the abbot," he'd grumbled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the precinct floor. "He's a big shot around here. Figured it was none of my damn business." He specified that the person dragging the woman was thin and had grayish hair, a description that fit both Abbot Thomas and the quiet, stooped monk, Brother Michael. A woman named Carol, who ran a small food stall, recalled seeing fresh, ugly bruises on the wrist of a young nun who had visited her in 2007. The nun had claimed she fell while working in the garden, but Carol now suspected abuse. Another witness, a hiker named La Sin, had overheard two nuns arguing furtively by a stream. One was crying, saying she wanted to leave, to go home. The other was warning her, telling her she would be punished if she did not consult someone first. The exchange reeked of fear and control. On the 24th of July, a phone call to a hotline the police had set up brought another heartbreaking piece of the puzzle. It was a man from a small town in rural China. He said his sister, a devout Buddhist, had been staying at the sanctuary. In July of 2007, she had called him, her voice tight with a fear he had never heard before. She'd said things were not good at the temple, that the abbot was not the holy man he appeared to be, and that she wanted to leave, to come home. It was the last time he ever spoke to her. Her name matched one in the abbot's ledger, and her DNA would later match one of the bodies from the pit. On the 2nd of August, Sister Ngoc Lien, one of the nuns, revealed a crucial detail. She had seen Brother Michael in the backyard late one night, around the time many of the victims were likely buried. She noticed he had fresh, deep scratches on his hand. When she asked, he claimed he'd been clearing thorny bushes, but his evasiveness had troubled her. On the 7th, a local nurse, Trejuan, recalled a nun visiting her clinic with bruises in 2007. Attributing them to hard work. She now realized it was likely abuse. Mark Yen, the wood vendor, had seen an older person with gray hair standing over a slumped, unmoving nun in the temple's backyard one night in September 2007. The stories were all different, yet they all painted the same terrifying picture of imprisonment, violence, and fear. The evidence was now a mountain, overwhelming and irrefutable. It pointed squarely at the two men with the most authority and the most consistent presence within the temple walls, Abbot Thomas and his quiet, ever-present shadow, Brother Michael. Both had been questioned repeatedly, and both had consistently denied any knowledge of the murders or the origins of the increasingly incriminating items. The abbot claimed the temple was a large open place and that he couldn't possibly know everything that happened within its walls. He claimed many people had keys to the storerooms and that the locked chest was a forgotten relic. Brother Michael, for his part, simply blamed the abbot for everything, claiming he only did what he was told. The critical, case-breaking breakthrough came on the 11th of August. It was a piece of strategic, psychological genius on Miles Corrigan's part. He had Abbot Thomas and Brother Michael brought into a single interrogation room together. The room was small, bare, and claustrophobic. Miles told them in a weary, offhand voice that he was done for the day, and that they would be transported back to the county jail in an hour. He left them alone in the room, a room he had told them was unmonitored, a room where in fact a single hidden camera was silently rolling. For nearly an hour they sat in absolute silence, two statues carved from guilt. Then Brother Michael, his composure finally cracking under the immense pressure, began to speak. His voice was a hoarse, desperate whisper. "I can't take the blame for you, Thomas," he rasped, his eyes wide with panic. "I can't. You were the one who dragged them into the storeroom. You did it. I didn't actively participate. I just helped you clean up." "Silence, you fool," the abbot hissed, his voice losing its gentle melodic quality for the very first time, replaced by a cold reptilian venom. "You will say nothing. They have no proof of who did what. Hold your tongue." But they did have proof. They had it all on tape. their shared guilt, their conspiracy, the Abbot's clear role as the mastermind, all laid bare by their own panicked, self-incriminating words. It was the final, brutal nail in their coffins. On the night of August 12th, in a cold, sterile, brightly lit interrogation room, facing the irrefutable video evidence of his own words, the mask of Abbot Thomas finally fell away completely. There was no more piety, no more calm compassion. There was only a cold, hollow, chilling emptiness. He confessed. He told them that in early 2007, the sanctuary had fallen on hard financial times. Donations were down. Few new, wealthy patrons were coming to stay. He began to develop, in his own clinical, detached words, sexual desires for the young, vulnerable women who came to him seeking salvation. He was their guide, their spiritual father, a figure of absolute authority. They trusted him implicitly, and he exploited that trust, using his power to satisfy his depraved, ugly urges. And when they resisted, when they threatened to leave, to go to the police, to expose him for the monster he truly was. His all-consuming fear of his reputation being destroyed, of losing the prestige and power he had so carefully and meticulously cultivated over the years, became his primary driving motive. He couldn't let them leave. He couldn't let them speak, so he killed them. He told Miles, his voice devoid of any emotion, that he couldn't stop himself. The first murder occurred in March of 2007. A young nun had threatened to report him. In a storeroom, he had suffocated her. He had buried her body in a shallow temporary grave in the backyard. When her murder went undiscovered, when no one came looking for her, he realized how easy it was. He continued to use the same method whenever a nun resisted his advances or threatened to expose his dark secret. He typically used his bare hands, he said, sometimes pressing them against the cold stone walls, sometimes using wet cloths to muffle their desperate, terrified screams. He confessed to burying all 13 bodies himself, usually alone, in the single large pit behind the temple, leveraging the secluded location and his unquestioned authority to move about at night. He reiterated that his primary motivations were his sexual gratification and the paralyzing fear of losing his revered status. He claimed he didn't intend to kill them, not at first, but was compelled by fear. It was a lie as transparent as his false piety. He also revealed Brother Michael's role. Sometimes he said his accomplice had assisted him, either by being forced or by fearing he would be implicated himself. Thong Tin, whose real name was Michael Peterson, later admitted to helping bury at least 4 of the victims and confirmed that the abbot was the direct perpetrator of all the murders. He was the janitor for a prolific serial killer. The sentences came swiftly. On the 23rd of August 2008, Abbot Thomas was sentenced to death for the murder of 13 people, along with charges of sexual assault and the systematic concealment of his crimes. Brother Michael was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for his role in assisting and concealing the horrific crimes. The sanctuary of the White Cloud was sealed indefinitely by court order, its heavy oak doors padlocked, its gentle wind chimes finally silenced. The remaining nuns who had cooperated with the police all left monastic life, their faith shattered, their lives forever traumatized and scarred by the intimate knowledge of the profound evil they had lived alongside. The case, which had taken over a month and a half of relentless police work to solve, left a lasting, ugly wound on the small community of Shadow Creek. The victims' identities were all eventually confirmed, and their remains were returned to their grieving families or interred in a quiet corner of the district cemetery. The case served as a grim, chilling lesson in the terrible power of silence, a testament to how evil can flourish and fester when good people are too afraid to speak, and how a holy place can be twisted into a tomb.